Okay, so we are already in our part 5 of this tutorial series, and in this video we are going to focus on creating camera, lights, and global illumination so that we can be able to test render when we apply a material shader and texture into our objects in the next video in part 6. Okay, so if you want to see how we did this object, just go on and watch the part 5 until part 4. And as you can see here now that I already rearranged this object into this using move tool and scale and rotate tool. Okay, so for this video, let's open the 3D modeling mag part 5 max. Okay, and I'm going to provide this exercise file. Okay, and let's go into left view, press letter L and zoom out, and press letter G so that we cannot see the grid line, and make sure that you are in a create tab, and under create tab let's go on to shape, and we are going to create a line object. Click that line, and let's start over here, just this far. Click here and hold the shift key on our keyboard so that we can create a straight line. Single click, single click, single click, and single click. Okay, and if you're done, right click and right click once more to end the creation process of this line object. Okay, now let's go into modifier tab, and we can now see here the its properties in this modifier tab over here. And now let's enter into vertex mode, and in vertex mode select these vertices. Okay, just hold the control key so that you can select multiple vertices, and under geometry group let's go on and click this fillet button, and using that fillet button try dragging over our selected vertices. Okay, and that should be enough, I think. And release your mouse button and drag this and fillet this vertex as well, right? And don't forget to turn off this fillet by clicking this one or right click. Okay, so now let's go to perspective view. Press letter P, and I'm gonna zoom in into here. Okay, so now let's go into rendering group, and in rendering group enable viewport. Check that one, and it's gonna give our object a physical form. And of course let's enable in render as well. Check that one so that if we render our scene we can also see the physical form of it. Okay, so this is currently in a radial shape, and I want to change it into rectangular shape. Okay, check this one and zoom out. Press F3 so that we can see through our object, and let's expand the length value by dragging these adjustment arrows up. Okay, drag this up. Okay, and that should be enough. And now press F3, exit our editing in here by clicking this layer. Okay, and go to left view. Okay, and now I want to move this object in a y-axis. Click this y arrow axis, click that one. Okay, just once. Lock our selection so that we won't deselect this object, and zoom in here and try moving it up until it touches at the bottom of this object. Okay, zoom out, and don't forget to unlock your selection, and go to top view, zoom out, press F3 on our keyboard and deselect. and you should be able to see V-Ray toolbars at the left side. And if you cannot see these things, right click in here and check V-Ray toolbar. Okay, so I'm gonna create a camera into our scene. Click this camera, and it would ask us if we would like to change our current renderer to V-Ray. Click yes and start creating a camera. Click and drag over here and make sure that you focus on our object. Okay, now let's change our viewport layout into something like this. So let's click this arrow and click this icon. Okay, so now we are now seeing a two different viewport. The other one is the top view and the one is the front view. Make sure that you're actively working in a top view. Okay, so you should see a yellow highlight on the top view, and it says that you are already actively working on a top view. Okay, so I'm gonna change the top view in the camera view. Press letter C. Okay, press F3 and change the realistic. Click that one and change it to shaded mode. Okay, press shift letter F to bring up the safe frame. Okay, and now let's navigate and zoom in into our object using this icon. Zoom in, pan, zoom out a bit, rotate, pan, zoom out, okay, and rotate. Alright, and now right click in front view so that we can work here in front viewport. Press letter P on our keyboard, press F3 and change the shading into shaded and zoom out. Okay, so now we have to focus on working in perspective view and avoid unnecessary navigation here in camera view so that we won't be messing up with this viewport. Okay, so keep on working in here. Now let's test render our scene. Click this icon. Okay, so the frame buffer renders the perspective view instead of the camera view. Okay, so let's bring up the render setup by clicking this icon or press F10 on your keyboard. Okay, and under render setup over here, in view, click this drop down arrow and choose V-Ray camera and lock it up so that every time we test render, it would only render the camera view. Okay, so now let's test render by clicking this icon or this button. It has the same function. Okay, click that one, render. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to expand the pixels of this frame buffer. So we are currently rendering in a 640 times 480 pixels. So under command tab in a output size group, let's lock the aspect ratio. Click that lock, and in width let's enter a value of 1500 pixels, and of course the height will instantly follow as we change the value of this width because we already locked up the aspect ratio. Okay, now I'm gonna close this one. Okay, and let's fix the camera exposure, and so that we can render this into a much brighter and vibrant image. Okay, now let's go into rendering and bring up the environment dialog or press number 8 on your keyboard, and under environment tab, exposure control group, click this drop down arrow and choose V-Ray exposure, and under V-Ray exposure let's change the mode to, click this drop down arrow and choose V-Ray camera, and in camera node let's use this camera as our node. Of course, click this none and click this camera, and this camera will start to show up in this camera node button. Okay, now let's close this one, and with this camera still selected, go into modifier tab so that we can see its properties over here. And we have to change only two things in here, the shutter speed and film speed. In shutter speed, let's give it a value of 45 and the film speed around 600. 600. And now let's test render our scene. Click this button or this one. Okay. Alright. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to change or apply some material shader into our object for temporary. Okay, so let's bring up the render setup again, and in Vray tab, expand the global switches, and under here let's check the override material and click the none button, and it will bring up the material map browser dialog. And under Vray group, expand that and choose Vray MTL and press OK. Now let's test render our scene. And as you can see here that it already override our scene with this material. And the next thing we need to do is I want to change its color into a white instead of gray. So let's bring up the material editor or press this icon or press the F10 on your keyboard. Okay, and you may see a slate material editor mode. So just go onto mode and shift into a compact material editor so that it won't occupy too much space in our interface. Okay, and under empty material slot, click and drag this material number 2 here and choose instance and press OK. And under diffuse group here in diffuse color, click that one and change it to white and press OK. Test render and you're done. Okay, now I'm gonna close this one and close this one. So now I'm close this one, of course, and now let's change this perspective view into left view. Zoom out and deselect everything. So we are now ready to create a light into our scene. So click this Vray plane light. Click and drag at this size. Okay, and make sure that it is placed at this exact placement over here, and it should be cover this area. Okay, and go back to perspective view, press letter P, navigate, and with this object selected, let's move it using the move tool and drag it into X direction. Okay, now hold the shift key on your keyboard while moving your object into X axis, and it's gonna duplicate our object into a new one. Press copy and press OK. So the next thing we need to do is to rotate this object 180 using this rotate tool, and turn on these angles now so that we can rotate this exactly 180 degrees. Hover your mouse into x-axis and rotate that one. Okay, so that's it. And now I'm gonna duplicate this object once more. Press copy and OK and rotate. Okay, and now let's test render our scene. Test render. Okay, so here's our latest result, and the next thing we need to do is to give this light a proper intensity. So I'm gonna start off with this light, select this light, and go to modifier tab. And here in its properties, give this light a value of multiplier of 1. Okay, and select this light, give it a value of multiplier 1 as well, and let's reduce its size, the length. Try dragging these adjustment arrows at the length, drag it down. Okay, click this light object and give it a multiplier around zero 0.5 and test render our scene again. Okay, so here's our latest render, and you may want to see up close into our image by scrolling your middle mouse button. Okay, and you can see here now that the surface has some grain effect. Okay, so to eliminate those noises that we are seeing in here, uh, select this. I'm gonna start off with this one, and uh, under its properties over here in sampling, let's give it a higher value of subdivision. Okay, around 16 or 24. So I want to set it up in 24. And as we give it a higher subdivision value, it will basically smoothen these grains into a surface of our object. And of course, we won't be able to see too much noises into this image anymore. Okay, so let's expand the subdivision and the other light objects. Okay, 24. Okay, so before I do another test render, uh, it's obviously that it will going to render these noises smooth. Okay, and okay, so the next thing we need to do is to add global illumination into our scene. Okay, we are done creating lights and cameras and give it a proper exposure, camera exposure and light intensity. So now let's bring up the render setup or press F10 in our keyboard. Okay, and under global illumination tab, click that one and click that enable global illumination and expand this irradiance map. And you can see here now that it uses a high settings. So let's change it. Click this drop down arrow and let's change it into a low. Okay, and now let's uh, change this basic into an expert mode so that we can access this multipass and uncheck that, because leaving that multipass check, uh, it the rendering will calculate the light cache and global illumination cache multiple times. So we don't need the V-Ray to calculate those light cache multiple times. So uncheck that multipass, and that's the basic of setting up global illumination. We can now close this render setup and do our final test render. Okay, and before ending this video, let's bring up the render setup, and don't forget of course to turn off the material override. Okay, here in V-Ray tab, uncheck this override material so that we can see the texture that we are going to apply in the next video in part 6. Okay, so that's the basic of rendering in using V-Ray inside 3ds Max. And of course in the next video, we just have to create material shader and apply a texture into our object. Okay, so that's it, and see you in the next video.